The sound of her keys clinking in her hand echoed through the quiet house, a symbol of everything she was about to lose. Old woman, he had called her, his voice dripping with authority. But in that instant, she felt more alive than she had in years. Martha sat in her favorite armchair, the worn fabric soft beneath her, the kind of chair that cradled her bones after a long day. The television played softly in front of her, a mindless comedy show that she'd seen dozens of times before. It was a comfort of sorts, something to fill the silence that often stretched out in the house when everyone was gone. Her fingers gently traced the edge of her cup, now empty, though she hadn't been paying attention to her tea. Her mind wandered, as it always did in these quiet moments, to the family members who barely seemed to visit anymore. Her son-in-law, Richard, had been distant for months, and her daughter, well, her daughter had been caught up in her own life, as everyone always was. Martha tried not to feel it, the creeping sensation that she was becoming invisible. The holidays had come and gone without much fanfare. No one asked for her opinion, no one needed her advice, and she supposed she was okay with it, or at least she told herself that. But as the silence filled the house around her, the feeling of being pushed to the edges of her own family grew unbearable. She shifted in her chair, feeling the creak in her joints. It had always been this way, hadn't it? She'd spent her life being a mother, a wife, a friend, always taking care of everyone else. And now that her own health was starting to fade, it seemed like the world was moving on without her. Her gaze drifted toward the hallway. She could hear the faint sound of footsteps approaching, and her heart gave a soft, involuntary lurch. Richard was coming, she realized with a sinking feeling. She hadn't expected him today, but he often stopped by in the afternoons to talk to Rachel, his wife, about something or other. The sound of his boots on the floor felt like an intrusion. No one had been here to visit her today, not even Rachel. Richard was different from the others. He always seemed to carry an air of authority with him, as if he thought he was the man of the house. It didn't bother Martha at first, but over time his subtle arrogance had started to grate. She had tried to ignore it, tried to keep the peace for Rachel's sake. But there were moments when Richard's tone or his dismissive glance made her blood boil. She put the cup down and straightened her back, wiping her hands on her lap. It was always like this when he came around, an awkward silence followed by polite pleasantries, then him leaving as quickly as he arrived. But today she could feel something was different. A storm was building. She just didn't know it yet. Richard entered through the front door with his usual brisk stride. He was a tall man, strong-looking, his features sharp and severe. He had always carried himself with a certain pride, and even now as he slipped off his coat and walked into the living room, his posture was one of unspoken authority. It had always been this way with him. He was the man who took charge, the one who made decisions, the one who told people what to do. It wasn't that he disliked his mother-in-law, but Martha had a way of reminding him of things he didn't want to think about, things like aging and mortality, things he was trying desperately to avoid. Richard had always been uncomfortable around older people. They made him aware of his own limitations, his own fears. He was in his early 40s now, but the passing of time was starting to weigh on him. His mind was elsewhere as he walked toward the living room, a million thoughts rushing through his head. The house felt quieter than usual. Rachel had been on edge lately, and their conversations had become increasingly strained. He wasn't sure what was going wrong, but he could feel the distance growing between them. He thought about the argument they'd had last night, the one where she'd asked him if he even remembered the last time they'd had a real conversation. And there was Martha, too, sitting there in the corner like a piece of furniture. To Richard, she represented everything he wanted to avoid, the slow decline, the vulnerability, the helplessness that seemed to come with age. He didn't know why he felt it so strongly, but he resented her presence in his home. He found her sitting in the armchair, staring at the screen without really watching it. He could tell she hadn't even noticed him walk in. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her. There was a fragility about her, one he hadn't paid much attention to before, but now it seemed glaringly obvious. She was, after all, getting older. And yet, his thoughts weren't entirely about her. They were about Rachel, and the distance between them, and the things he could never seem to say. Richard cleared his throat, suddenly irritated with the silence. "Martha," he said, his voice sharp, though he hadn't intended it to be. Martha turned to him slowly, her gaze lifting to meet his, though there was a distant look in her eyes. "Yes?" she asked softly, though she already knew what was coming. He didn't hesitate. His words spilled out in a cold rush. "Go to your room, old woman, now." Martha froze, the words hanging in the air like an accusation. Her breath caught in her chest, but she didn't move. He couldn't have said that. He didn't just say that. She blinked, trying to process what had just happened. It was as if time had slowed down, the sound of his voice reverberating in her mind, but she couldn't make sense of it. For a moment, she thought maybe she'd misheard him. She must have, but the look on his face told her it was real. Something inside her snapped. Her fingers curled tightly around the armrest of the chair, her knuckles white. Her breath steadied as a wave of defiance rose up in her. Her old, tired body rose from the chair more quickly than she had expected. She didn't know what had come over her, but she didn't want to let him see her shrinking away in fear. Martha didn't say a word. She simply walked toward the door, grabbed her keys from the table by the entrance, and left. Have you ever had a moment when a single word or action completely changed how you saw someone you thought you knew? How did you handle it? Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now, let us begin. Martha's heart pounded as she stepped out of the house, her shoes clicking sharply on the pavement. The night air was cool, biting at her skin, but she barely noticed. The anger and confusion roiling inside her made the cold almost seem like a relief. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay there, not after what had just happened. She didn't stop walking until her feet carried her to the small park at the end of the block. It was dark now, the streets quiet, the only sound being the rustle of trees in the breeze. She sat on the old bench near the fountain, her hands trembling as she gripped her keys tightly. Her mind was racing, replaying Richard's words over and over again. Old woman, now. It was the way he'd said it, like it was nothing, like she was some insignificant thing that could be brushed aside. He had always been distant, yes, but this was different. This was a humiliation that cut deeper than any argument they had ever had. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, staring at Rachel's name on the screen. Her daughter's concerned face flashed across her mind, but she couldn't talk to Rachel about this. Not yet. She wasn't sure if she could even look her in the eye right now. Richard's voice. Meanwhile, back at the house, Richard stood in the living room, his hands gripping the edge of the table. His heart was racing. The words had slipped out before he could stop them, and now he couldn't shake the heaviness in his chest. He didn't even know why he'd said it. Why had he called her that? Why had he told her to go to her room? He tried to justify it in his mind. He was just frustrated, tired, and dealing with things at work. But deep down, he knew it wasn't about that. It wasn't about the late meeting or the pressure from his boss. It was about him, about how he felt like everything in his life was slipping out of his control. It was easier to lash out at Martha than it was to face the growing distance between him and Rachel. Easier to push her away than to admit that his marriage was unraveling. Easier to blame someone else for his own failings than to confront his feelings of inadequacy. Richard had always prided himself on being the one who kept things together, the one who made the decisions, who was strong for his family. But lately, the cracks were showing. He had been angry, but now there was only regret. Rachel hadn't said a word about what had happened, but he could feel the tension between them. She hadn't even looked at him properly when he came home. She was distant, too, and Richard had no idea how to fix it. Was it his fault? Was it Martha's? He didn't know anymore. He took a deep breath and grabbed his jacket. He needed to fix this, needed to talk to Martha. But she was gone. He hadn't seen her leave, but the door was wide open. Richard cursed under his breath, running his hand through his hair. He grabbed his phone and texted Rachel, "Where's your mom?" The reply came almost immediately. "I don't know. I'll call her." He felt the sinking feeling in his chest. He needed to find her, needed to make things right. But where would she go at this hour? Martha had walked aimlessly for what felt like hours. When she finally looked at the time on her phone, she realized it was past midnight. She had never intended to stay out this long, but the weight of everything pressing on her chest kept her from turning back. She was still angry, but she was also hurting, and there was a nagging, growing realization that she hadn't just been humiliated, she had been forgotten. In her mind, the last time she had truly felt seen by Richard was long ago. Maybe when he first married Rachel, he had been respectful, even kind, but over the years, things had shifted. He became more distant, more cold, and now his words felt like the culmination of years of silence and subtle disregard. Martha sighed, her breath fogging in front of her. She felt like she didn't belong anywhere. Her daughter was growing further away, and her son-in-law's treatment made her feel like an intruder in her own home. She had always tried to keep peace, to be the matriarch of the family. But what did that even mean anymore? She didn't want to be that person, the one who complained about being treated poorly. She wanted to be the strong one, the one who could handle everything with grace. But grace wasn't what she had right now. What she had was anger and hurt and a deep, aching sense of loneliness. Her phone buzzed again. It was Rachel. "Mom, where are you? Dad's looking for you." Martha swallowed hard, her fingers hovering over the screen. She wanted to respond, wanted to tell Rachel what had happened, but she couldn't bring herself to. She wasn't ready to explain it all, to admit how deeply Richard's words had cut her. Instead, she typed back, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm fine. I just needed some air." But she wasn't fine, and deep down she knew it. Richard had driven through the streets for nearly an hour, his eyes scanning every corner, every alley. He hadn't intended for this to happen. He never should have said those words. He knew it the moment they left his mouth. But now, as he searched for her, he realized just how badly he had messed up. He was angry at himself. He had hurt Martha, and he had hurt Rachel, too, by allowing this tension to fester. But worse than that, he realized that he had been running from the truth for too long. He wasn't just frustrated about Martha, he was frustrated with himself, with the life he'd built, and more than anything, he was afraid of losing everything. When he finally found her, sitting alone on a bench in the park, he didn't know what to say. The words seemed so small compared to the weight of what he'd done. He stood there for a moment, just watching her. She looked so small in the darkness, so vulnerable, like a woman who had been carrying too much for far too long. He felt a sudden wave of guilt wash over him. "Martha," he said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "I'm sorry." Have you ever said something in anger that you instantly regretted? How did you try to make it right afterward? The park was silent, except for the rustling of leaves. Martha sat still on the bench, the cold air biting at her skin, yet she didn't feel it. Richard's footsteps approached slowly, his presence looming before her like a shadow she couldn't escape. She didn't look up. She couldn't. If she did, she feared that the floodgates would open and everything she had tried to bury would come rushing to the surface. She heard him stop a few paces away, the weight of his silence heavy. She could almost feel him hesitating, unsure of how to bridge the chasm he had created between them. She wasn't sure what he wanted from her. Words? Apology? She had heard enough empty words in her life to last a lifetime, especially from him. "Martha," Richard said again, softer this time, the regret in his voice unmistakable. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that." Still, she didn't look up. She kept her gaze fixed on the dark horizon, her fingers wrapped tightly around the keys in her hand. She didn't need to look at him to know how he must be standing, stiff, uncomfortable, waiting for her to say something, anything. The way his voice quivered slightly made her want to laugh bitterly. He was the one who had caused this, the one who had shattered whatever fragile piece they had, and now he was acting like the victim. "Sorry," she muttered under her breath. "Sorry doesn't fix anything." Richard took a hesitant step forward, his eyes scanning her face, though she kept it hidden in the shadow of the dim streetlight. "I know it doesn't," he replied quietly. "I don't expect it to, but I need you to understand, Martha. I never meant to hurt you. I don't know what's been happening to me lately." Martha finally turned her head toward him, her gaze piercing the darkness, locking on his. Her lips pressed tightly together, her expression unreadable. He was trying, wasn't he? But she couldn't let herself believe it was enough. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back to the way things were before. She had spent too many years letting herself be walked over, letting her dignity slip away because she wanted to keep the peace. But not this time, not anymore. "What do you expect me to do, Richard?" Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was a sharp edge to it. "You don't get to just walk in here, throw your insults around, and then think a few words of apology will fix it. Do you really think that's all it takes?" Richard flinched, the sting of her words hitting him like a slap. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, unsure of what to say. He had always been good at offering solutions, at fixing problems, but this was different. This was beyond the simple fix of a handshake or a nice gesture. This was deep, real pain, and it wasn't something he could just smooth over. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," Richard said, his voice breaking slightly. He took a step closer, his hand reaching out toward her, but he stopped short. He wasn't sure if she wanted him near her, and something in the way she held herself, so rigid and closed off, told him she didn't. "I've been under a lot of stress lately, but that's no excuse for what I said. You deserve more than that, Martha. I know that." Martha finally stood up, the motion slow and deliberate, like she was shedding some invisible weight. She took a step back, putting distance between them, her eyes never leaving his. The movement felt final, as if she was stepping out of the emotional space they had once shared, a space that no longer existed. "I did deserve more," she said firmly, her voice thick with emotion, "but you never gave it to me, not really. You and Rachel, I tried, Richard. I tried to be there for you, to be part of your lives, but somewhere along the way, I became invisible to both of you. And maybe it's my fault, maybe I let it happen, but I won't apologize for wanting to be treated with respect, not anymore." Richard's chest tightened, a knot forming in his throat. He hadn't realized the extent of what had been building inside her. The bitterness in her words hit him harder than he had anticipated, and for a moment he felt small. He hadn't been listening, not really. All this time he had been so wrapped up in his own frustrations and anger, he hadn't seen how much pain he was causing. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way," Richard said quietly, his voice full of regret. I never wanted to hurt you." Martha let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking her head. "I don't know if you ever wanted to hurt me, Richard, but you did, and I don't know if you even realize how deep that cut. It's not just what you said, it's everything leading up to it. The way you treated me, the way you treat Rachel like she's a stranger instead of your wife. Maybe I'm old, but I'm not stupid." Richard's face softened, the hardness of his earlier expression giving way to something deeper, something more vulnerable. He stepped forward again, this time closing the distance between them just enough to make her look at him. He wasn't going to run from this. He had already run too long. "I've messed up, Martha. I've been running from everything, from my own mistakes, and I thought I could just keep it all together, but I can't, not anymore. I don't know how to fix things between us, but I'm here. I'm trying. Please, just give me a chance." Martha stood in silence for a long moment, her face a mask of mixed emotions. He wanted her to believe him, wanted her to accept his apology, but he wasn't sure she could. And deep down, Richard wasn't sure he had earned it. She had been so strong, so resilient, and now she was finally showing the cracks in her armor. She didn't need him to fix it. She needed him to see her, to acknowledge the years she had spent quietly sacrificing herself for the sake of family. Martha's breath was steady now, though the weight of the moment still pressed down on her chest. She had been expecting this apology, but it didn't fill the void. It didn't erase the years of resentment that had built between them. Could she ever forgive him? Could she forgive herself for allowing him to treat her this way for so long? "I don't know if I can just forgive you," she said finally, her voice steady but soft. "But I'm willing to try. Not for you, not for Rachel, but for me. I've spent my whole life trying to make everyone else happy. Maybe it's time I started thinking about myself for a change." Richard nodded, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "I don't expect it to be easy," he said, his voice low, "but I'll do whatever it takes. I promise." Have you ever had a moment where you had to choose between forgiving someone and protecting yourself? What did you do? The next day, the tension between Richard and Martha lingered like an unspoken weight in the air. It had been hours since their conversation in the park, and yet nothing had truly been resolved. Richard had left, telling her he would give her space, and she had agreed to it, partly because she needed time to think, but also because she didn't know how to react. The words had been said, the apology given, but something still felt broken. She wasn't sure how to put the pieces back together. But when she woke up this morning, her phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. It was brief, but it was enough to shake her out of her thoughts. "Mom, I need you to come to the house. Something happened with Richard. Can you come now?" Martha hadn't expected this. She had assumed the distance between her daughter and Richard would remain, but the urgency in Rachel's message pulled at her heart. She didn't know what was going on, but she knew she had to go. As soon as she stepped into the house, she was hit with an overwhelming sense of chaos. The house was empty, but it felt tense, like the calm before a storm. Richard was nowhere to be found, but Rachel stood in the kitchen, her eyes wide as if she had been waiting for Martha's arrival. "Mom, I don't know what's going on," Rachel said, her voice strained with anxiety. "But I need your help. Richard's gone. He didn't come back last night and he hasn't called. I'm worried." Martha's heart sank. She hadn't expected this. She had assumed after their conversation, Richard would at least try to make things right. But now the reality of the situation was sinking in. Richard had run away, not physically, but emotionally, and Rachel, her daughter, was left picking up the pieces. Martha reached out, taking her daughter's hands in hers. "Rachel, we need to stay calm. Let's figure this out together, okay? We'll find him." Rachel nodded, but the look in her eyes told Martha everything she needed to know. Her daughter was scared, not just for Richard, but for their family as a whole. There was so much unsaid between them, so much distance. Richard's behavior had been wearing on Rachel for months, and now this? Now it felt like the cracks were finally breaking wide open. "I don't know where he went," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't even tell me. I'm so tired, Mom. I'm so tired of fighting. I don't know what's happening anymore." Martha's heart ached for her daughter. She had always been the strong one, the one who tried to hold everything together, but now Rachel was showing signs of the same exhaustion that had been weighing down on her for years. And maybe, just maybe, Martha could help. They sat down together, Martha's hand resting gently on Rachel's. "I know it's hard, sweetheart, but we'll get through this, one step at a time." They didn't have time to wait for Richard to return. They had to move forward, and quickly. Martha suggested they begin by checking his favorite places, the ones he would usually retreat to when he was feeling overwhelmed. It was a far-fetched idea, but it was all they had. They drove in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound filling the car. It felt strangely comfortable, the two of them together. For the first time in a long time, Martha felt like she was doing something for her daughter, not just being the passive observer in the background, but actively helping to solve a problem. When they arrived at Richard's favorite fishing spot by the lake, they found his truck parked by the water, the engine still warm. Martha's heart fluttered nervously. Was he here? Was he all right? They both stepped out of the car, walking toward the water's edge. The lake stretched out before them, dark and still, reflecting the faint light of the evening sky. The air was cool, and the scent of damp earth filled her nose. Richard's rod lay forgotten on the ground, a sign that he had left in a hurry, or perhaps that he had been here for longer than expected. As they walked closer, Martha caught sight of Richard sitting on a bench near the shore, staring out across the water, his face unreadable. His posture was tense, like he was lost in thought, lost in the weight of everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. "Richard?" Martha called gently, her voice carrying across the quiet water. He didn't turn around immediately. His shoulders were stiff, and for a long moment he didn't acknowledge them. But then, slowly, he turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. They were tired, bloodshot, filled with the kind of exhaustion only someone who had been running from themselves for too long could understand. "I didn't know where else to go," Richard said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I couldn't face either of you, not yet." Martha's heart broke as she looked at him. She could see the weight of guilt in his eyes, the shame that had been festering since the night before. But this time she didn't feel the anger she had felt earlier. This time she understood. He was hurting too. And maybe, just maybe, they could help each other heal. "We're here now," Martha said softly, sitting down beside him on the bench. "We don't have to have all the answers, Richard, but we need to start talking. We need to be honest with each other for once." Rachel stood a few feet away, watching them. She was still silent, but her presence was enough to hold them together in that fragile moment of connection. It was strange, being here together like this, three people who had been so distant, so disconnected for so long. But something about this moment felt like the first step toward healing. Richard looked at Martha, his face weary but open, as if he was finally ready to confront the mess he had made. "I've been so afraid, Martha. I've been afraid of everything, of failing, of being a disappointment. I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to fix me." Martha nodded, her hand reaching out to touch his. "We can fix this, but we have to do it together." Rachel stepped forward then, her voice trembling but steady. "I don't want to lose either of you. Please, just be honest with each other." Martha looked at her daughter and then at Richard, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions. This was their chance. They could rebuild this even if it took time. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it was a road they could walk together. Have you ever been in a situation where a family member was struggling and you had to come together to help them? How did you handle it? The air around the lake had grown colder, and Martha could feel the chill in her bones, but she didn't care. Richard sat next to her, his gaze fixed on the dark, still water. It was as if they were both lost in the vastness of their shared silence, struggling to find the right words, the right path forward. Rachel stood a few steps away, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, a look of concern on her face. Martha was tired of the distance, tired of the uncertainty that seemed to hang over their family like a dark cloud. But in this moment, she realized that the silence between her and Richard wasn't just because of what had happened yesterday. It was a silence that had been building for years. Maybe it had started with small things, unspoken frustrations, misunderstandings that never got addressed. Maybe it was just the way life had drifted them apart, but somewhere along the line they had stopped seeing each other. As they sat there in that uncomfortable stillness, Richard broke the silence with a deep sigh, his voice quieter now, almost vulnerable. "I don't know where to start," he said, glancing at Martha before looking away. "I've never been good at talking about feelings, but I think you deserve to know why I've been so distant, why I've been so angry." Martha turned to him, her eyes softening, but her heart remained guarded. She had spent so much of her life trying to understand her family, trying to keep things together, but it had never felt like enough. Now Richard's words, raw and honest, felt like a fragile opening, and she wasn't sure whether she was ready to step through it. "I don't know if you ever really knew, Martha," Richard continued, his voice shaky, "but I've been running from the person I thought I had to be, the person I thought I had to become. I thought if I kept up the image, if I kept being the strong guy, the provider, the one who always had it together, then everything would work out. I thought that's what Rachel needed from me. I thought that's what the family needed from me." Martha's eyes softened, a wave of understanding washing over her. She had always known Richard carried some kind of burden, but she had never realized how heavy it truly was. "But what I didn't realize," Richard said, swallowing hard, "was that I was losing myself in the process. I was so focused on being perfect, on being the man I thought everyone needed, that I didn't see that the thing I was afraid of most was failure. I didn't know how to face my own weaknesses, my own fears." Richard ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head as if trying to push the memories away, but they wouldn't go. "I wasn't always like this," he continued, his voice breaking. "I grew up in a house where things weren't easy. My dad, he wasn't the kind of man you could talk to. He expected a lot from me, and I could never live up to his expectations. And my mom, she was always so quiet, always so willing to let my dad take the reins. I was the son, the one who was supposed to keep everything in line, and I guess I just kept carrying that with me." Richard looked at Martha then, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and sadness. "I don't want to be like him," Richard whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to be that man, but I've been afraid of letting anyone down, afraid of being a failure, and I pushed everyone away, including you." Martha took a deep breath, letting his words sink in. There was so much pain in his confession, so much unspoken history, and yet, in this moment, she realized that they weren't so different. She had her own history, her own wounds, her own fears. They both had been running from their own vulnerabilities, running from the truths they didn't want to face. "I know," Martha said softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything she had felt over the years. "I've seen it, I've felt it, but you weren't alone in this, Richard. You never were." Richard's eyes flickered with something, maybe hope, maybe relief. He seemed to finally understand that his actions had been about more than just his own struggles. They had affected everyone around him, especially Martha and Rachel. But he was starting to see that they weren't the enemy. They were the ones who could help him heal, the ones who could help him find his way back. I wish I had seen that sooner, Richard said, his voice cracking. I wish I hadn't been so blind. I pushed you away, and I'm sorry. Martha reached out, her hand gently resting on his. For the first time in a long time, it felt like they were on the same page. She had spent so many years trying to protect herself, trying to protect her family, but now she realized that she couldn't do it alone. They had all been carrying their burdens in silence, afraid to be vulnerable, afraid to admit their pain. But now, in this fragile moment, there was a glimmer of something more, a possibility that things could be different, that they could finally heal together. I don't need you to be perfect, Richard, Martha said softly, her voice steady but warm. I just need you to be honest, with me, with Rachel, with yourself. Rachel, who had been standing quietly by the water's edge, finally stepped forward, her eyes filled with emotion. I just want you both to be happy, she said, her voice thick with the weight of everything she had been carrying too. I don't want to lose either of you. Please, just start being honest. Please. Martha turned to her daughter, offering her a soft smile. We will, sweetheart. We will. In that moment, it felt like something had shifted between them. The silence that had once filled their family with distance and uncertainty was starting to break apart. Maybe it wouldn't be easy, maybe it would take time, but for the first time in a long time, Martha felt a sense of hope. Maybe they could heal, maybe they could rebuild. Have you ever had a moment where you realized that understanding someone's past helped you see them differently? How did it change the way you interacted with them? The days that followed felt like a delicate balance, fragile yet full of potential. After the conversation at the lake, things between Martha, Richard, and Rachel had started to shift. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't easy, but there was a change. The walls that had once separated them were slowly starting to crumble. Richard had returned to the house that evening, exhausted but resolute. Martha could see the change in him, subtle but significant. His eyes were softer, more open, as if he was no longer carrying the weight of his past alone. And Rachel, who had been so distant and anxious, began to breathe a little easier, though her eyes still held the scars of the past months. She wasn't fully healed, not yet, but the strain between Richard and Rachel was starting to lift. They spent the following days talking, really talking, for the first time in years. There were awkward silences at first, moments where they all faltered, unsure of what to say or how to approach one another. But there was also a tenderness in the air, a desire to reconnect. Martha noticed how Richard would occasionally glance at her with an expression that was both apologetic and thankful, as if he was silently asking for her forgiveness for the years of silence and distance between them. He didn't have to say the words, they were understood. The honesty of their conversation at the lake had already begun to heal something deep inside them all. One evening, after a quiet dinner together, Martha and Richard found themselves alone in the living room. Rachel had gone to her room, and the house was filled with a calm, almost peaceful silence. It felt like the first real moment of peace they had shared in ages. Richard sat across from Martha on the couch, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. He was tired, but his eyes were clearer now, no longer clouded by guilt or anger. For the first time in a long time, he seemed present, truly present. I've been thinking about what you said, Richard started, his voice low but steady, about being honest, and I think it's time for me to stop pretending I have everything figured out. I've been so afraid of admitting I was wrong, but I can see now that I need to be honest with you, with Rachel, with myself. Martha smiled softly, a warmth in her chest she hadn't expected. This wasn't the Richard she had once known, the one who held everything inside and pushed people away. This was someone different, someone willing to face the mess he had created, willing to open up to the people he loved. "You don't have to have it all figured out," Martha said gently. "None of us do, but we have each other. That's all we need right now." Richard nodded, and for a moment they sat in silence, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. But this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt like understanding, a shared quiet where both of them were finally on the same page. "I never realized how much I took for granted," Richard said after a long pause, his voice soft. "I thought I had to be everything for everyone, but I never really saw what you needed, Martha. I was so focused on myself, on my own fear, that I didn't stop to see how much you had been giving up all these years." Martha looked at him, her heart swelling with a bittersweet recognition. She had always known, in her quiet way, that she had been carrying much of the emotional weight in the family. But hearing Richard admit it, hearing him see her, really see her, was something she had longed for. "I never wanted to be the martyr," she said with a small chuckle, though her voice was laced with sincerity. "But I think I got caught up in trying to keep things together. I kept thinking I had to make everything right for everyone else. I didn't want to admit that I needed help, that I needed to be seen, too." Richard's eyes softened, and he leaned in slightly, his voice filled with an emotion he had kept hidden for so long. "I see you now, Richard. I see you, and I'm sorry it took me so long." The words hung in the air between them, but they didn't feel heavy. They felt like a release, like the air had cleared in a way that made everything feel a little more hopeful. They were both admitting the truth in all its painful, messy glory, and it was healing. Martha reached over and took Richard's hand in hers. It was a simple gesture, but it was one that spoke volumes. She had been waiting for this, for him to finally acknowledge her, for him to let down the walls he had built around himself. And now that it was happening, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of relief. "I think we've both been running for too long," she said quietly, "but maybe it's time to stop." Richard nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "Maybe it is." There was a quiet understanding between them now, a bond that was beginning to rebuild. They didn't need to fix everything all at once. They didn't need to have all the answers. What mattered was that they were finally present, truly there for each other in a way they hadn't been in years. Later that evening, as Martha walked into the kitchen, she found Rachel sitting at the table, a mug of tea in front of her. She had a thoughtful look on her face, and her eyes were still tired, but there was a new softness in her expression that hadn't been there before. "How's it going?" Martha asked, leaning against the counter. Rachel looked up at her, her gaze steady but gentle. "It's better," she said, her voice quiet but filled with relief. "It's going to take time, I know that, but I think we're finally getting somewhere." Martha smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Rachel had always been the strongest one, the one who held it all together for so long. But now Martha could see the shift in her, the change in how she was beginning to let go of her own fears and hurt. They were both learning to be vulnerable, to be honest with each other and with themselves. "We are," Martha said softly. "We're getting somewhere." Have you ever had a conversation that completely changed the way you saw someone? How did it shift your relationship with them? The progress they had made over the past few days felt fragile, as though everything was on the verge of breaking apart. Martha had started to believe, cautiously, that the distance between herself, Richard, and Rachel was beginning to close. But she knew deep down that reconciliation didn't come easily, not after everything they had been through. And today, the fragile peace they had built shattered. It started when Rachel came home early from work, her expression a mix of frustration and exhaustion. Martha had just finished a cup of tea, her mind still processing the conversation she'd had with Richard the night before. She had been feeling hopeful, even optimistic for the first time in a long while. But that morning, something in the air felt off, a small crack in the surface that she couldn't quite place. When Rachel entered the kitchen, the door closing behind her with an unusual force, Martha immediately noticed her tense posture. "Hey, sweetheart, what's going on?" Martha asked, setting her mug down, her voice soft but filled with concern. Rachel's face twisted slightly, like she was fighting to hold something back. She exhaled sharply, rubbing her forehead as if trying to push away a headache that had been brewing for hours. "It's Richard," she said, her voice tight but filled with relief. "He's been distant again. I don't know what happened, but I feel like we're right back where we started." Martha froze, her pulse quickening. She had felt it too, the subtle shifts, the cracks in their newly formed bond. But hearing Rachel say it out loud was like a slap to the face. She had hoped so desperately that things were on the mend, but now it felt like she was standing on the edge of the same precipice. "Rachel, what do you mean distant?" Martha asked carefully, her voice catching in her throat. Rachel looked at her, her eyes flickering with a mixture of hurt and confusion. "He won't talk to me, Mom. He says everything is fine, that he's just stressed, but I can tell something's wrong. I'm not stupid. I can feel it when he's shutting me out." Martha swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. A heavy silence settled over them, thick with the weight of unspoken fears. For all the progress they had made, it was clear that Richard hadn't fully dealt with everything. He was still carrying the weight of his own unresolved issues that were far from being fixed. "I'll talk to him," Martha said finally, though her voice trembled slightly. She wanted to believe the connection they were building was enough to withstand whatever had happened, but she wasn't sure anymore. She wasn't sure if Richard was ready for it. Later that evening, Martha sat in the living room, the glow of the television casting faint shadows across the room. Richard had come home late, as he often did when he was avoiding confrontation. She had made him dinner, an olive branch of sorts, but he hadn't touched it. He had hardly looked at her since he walked in. She tried to ignore the knot in her stomach, the growing sense of dread that told her things were spiraling out of control. "Richard," she said quietly, her voice breaking the silence, "can we talk?" Richard glanced up at her, his face weary, eyes filled with a distant sadness. He had been staring at the floor, his fingers absently tapping against the armrest of the couch. He didn't say anything at first, just sighed deeply, as if trying to summon the energy to respond. "I don't know what's going on, Martha," Richard said, tired. I can't keep pretending everything's okay. I'm not okay." Martha's heart twisted. She had been waiting for this moment, for him to finally admit that the progress they had made wasn't enough to erase years of emotional baggage, but she hadn't expected it to come with such sharpness. His words, his tone, they hit her harder than she anticipated. "I know you're not okay, Richard," she replied softly, her eyes searching his face for answers. "But you've been pulling away from us again, from Rachel, from me. You say you're sorry, but then you disappear. I need you here, Richard. I need you to show up." Richard stood up abruptly, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I am here, Martha, but I'm not sure I can do this anymore. I don't know how to fix myself, let alone fix this, fix us." Martha stood too, her voice rising despite herself. "You can't keep running, Richard. You can't keep pushing people away just because it's easier to face what's wrong. You said you wanted to be honest, but this is just more of the same wall you've been building for years." Richard froze, the words hitting him like a slap. His chest tightened, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. "I didn't ask for this," Richard said, his voice a mixture of anger and pain. "I didn't ask for this life, for any of it. But I've been trying so hard to keep it together. You don't get it, Martha. I'm not strong enough for this. I can't be what you want me to be. I can't be what Rachel needs." Martha felt a sharp pain pierce her heart as Richard's words echoed in the room. This wasn't just about them. It was about his own self-worth, about the belief that he could never measure up to the ideal he had created in his mind. "This isn't about what I want from you, Richard," Martha said quietly, her voice breaking. "It's about what we need as a family. We need you to be present. We need you to show up, not just for me, not just for Rachel, but for yourself. You can't keep running from your own life." Richard's face crumpled, the vulnerability that had been hiding behind his anger finally spilling over. He turned away, his hand gripping the back of the couch. "I don't know how," he whispered. "I don't know how to fix this, how to fix myself." For a moment, Martha simply stood there, watching him, the weight of their broken conversation settling in. The air between them felt thick with the truth that neither of them was ready to face fully. She had hoped that things were improving, that the honesty and vulnerability they had begun to share would be enough to repair the cracks. But this was the breaking point, the shattering of illusions that had built up over years of silent suffering. "I can't do this alone," Martha said softly, her voice full of quiet sadness. "I need you to try, Richard. I need you to be here, not just for me, but for yourself." Have you ever been in a situation where you had to confront the truth even though you weren't ready for it? How did it change the way you moved forward? The days after Richard's outburst were quiet, uncomfortably so. The house, once filled with the murmur of shared meals and late-night conversations, now felt like a cavernous echo of what it had once been. Martha moved through the rooms as though walking in a dream, her footsteps soft, hesitant. Her conversations with Rachel had been careful, filled with questions neither of them wanted to ask but needed to. Richard was still distant, though he had tried, barely, to make amends in small, awkward gestures, but Martha knew better than to trust them completely. She hadn't heard from Richard much since that night. He left early in the morning, and when he returned, he would sit in the corner of the living room, distant, withdrawn. It was as if he was trying to decide something important, but couldn't find the courage to act on it. Martha had been waiting for him to make a decision, for him to take the next step. She had told him over and over that she couldn't do this alone, that they needed him to be honest, to be present, but it seems like he was stuck in the same place he had been for years, running from the things he couldn't face. She didn't know how much longer she could wait for him to make the choice. "You don't have to fix everything, Richard," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you have to choose. You have to choose to be here, to be with us, to be part of this family. We need you, but we can't keep waiting for you to decide if you're going to show up or not. It's your choice, but you have to choose." The silence between them was heavy, suffocating. Richard stared at her, his face twisted with anguish, his eyes haunted by everything he had yet to face. He knew she was right. He had been avoiding the truth for too long, and now, standing at this crossroads, he was forced to make a decision. "I've been so afraid of losing control," he said finally, his voice trembling. "Afraid that if I let go of the control I've built around my life, everything will fall apart. I've been holding on to the idea of what I should be instead of facing who I really am." Martha reached out, her hand gently resting on his. She didn't need him to have all the answers. She didn't need him to be perfect. All she needed was for him to choose to be vulnerable, to stop hiding, to stop running. "You don't have to be perfect, Richard," she said again, her voice steady. "Just be here. That's enough." Richard closed his eyes, a slow, heavy breath escaping him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he let himself be vulnerable. He let himself choose to stop running, to face the fear that had held him back for so long. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice filled with both relief and fear. "I'm here, and I'm going to try." The room seemed to breathe with them, as if the weight of the unspoken truths between them had finally begun to lift. It wasn't a perfect resolution, nothing would be, not overnight, but for the first time in a long time, they were both present, and that, in itself, was a beginning. As Richard sat beside her, Martha felt a shift, a softening of the tension that had plagued them. They were still far from perfect, but they had made a choice to show up, to be honest, to start again, and that was enough. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to face your own fears? How did it change your life moving forward? The days that followed Richard's decision were slow, but they were filled with a new kind of hope, a kind that neither Martha nor Richard had allowed themselves to feel in years. The heavy air that had hung over their home began to clear. Conversations, though still uncertain at times, began to feel more real, more open. Richard showed up, not just physically, but emotionally. He started sharing, bit by bit, the pieces of himself he had hidden away for so long, the fears, the insecurities, the pain he had buried in order to protect himself. And though the process wasn't easy, the simple act of being present, truly present, began to heal the space between them. Rachel, too, began to see the change in her father. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't always smooth. She still had her own wounds, her own frustrations, but she started to soften, to allow him back into her life in ways she hadn't thought possible. Slowly, they began to rebuild their relationship, one fragile step at a time. And as for Martha, the peace that had been absent for so long began to seep into her heart. It wasn't the kind of peace that came with everything being perfect. It was a quieter kind, a peace that came from acceptance. She no longer felt like she had to hold everything together by herself. She didn't have to be the one to make everything right for everyone else. The family wasn't healed overnight. There were still moments of tension, of old habits creeping back in. Richard still struggled with his own doubts and fears. Rachel still carried the scars of their past misunderstandings. But they were different now, open to change, open to vulnerability, and most importantly, open to each other. It was a month later when Martha came home from a long day of errands to find Richard sitting in the living room, the evening sun casting a warm glow over the room. He was holding a photograph in his hands, the edges slightly worn from years of handling. Martha recognized it immediately, a family photo from when Rachel was just a child, the three of them, Martha, Richard, and Rachel, smiling, the bond between them strong and easy. Richard looked up as she entered, his expression thoughtful. "I found this earlier," he said, his voice a little softer than usual. "I was going through some old boxes and came across it. I don't think I've seen it in years." Martha walked over and sat beside him, her hand reaching for the photograph. It was one of those rare moments in their past when everything had felt right, when they were all simply happy, unburdened by the weight of unspoken words and past mistakes. "I remember that day," Martha said quietly, a smile tugging at her lips. Rachel had just gotten her first bike. You couldn't stop laughing because she kept falling off of it, but she insisted she was fine. Richard chuckled softly, the sound warm and genuine. "She was so stubborn back then. She still is, actually." Martha smiled, her gaze softening. "She gets it from you." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the photograph between them. Richard's thumb gently traced the edge of the picture as if trying to reconnect with that simpler time. "I've been thinking," Richard said, his voice hesitant. "I want to do better. For you, for Rachel, for myself. I know I haven't been the husband or father I should have been, but I'm trying to be better, and I want to make it up to you both." Martha looked at him, her heart full. This wasn't an empty promise. She could see it in his eyes, the sincerity, the vulnerability. He wasn't just making words. He was committing to change, not for her, not for Rachel, but for himself. "I know you're trying," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "And that's all I've ever asked for, Richard, just for you to be here, to show up." Richard nodded, a faint but sincere smile on his face. "I'm here, Martha, and I'm not going anywhere." It wasn't perfect, but for the first time, Martha believed him. She had spent so many years trying to hold everything together, trying to fix what was broken. But now she understood that healing wasn't something you could force. It was something that had to be earned, piece by piece, moment by moment. And she could see the work happening right in front of her. It wasn't easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but it was real. A few weeks later, the family sat down for dinner together, a rare occurrence in recent months. The table, once filled with awkward silences and unspoken tension, now felt like a place of genuine connection. Richard had cooked, and although the meal wasn't perfect, the effort was enough. Rachel had even joined them at the table without hesitation, her face no longer closed off, but open, tentative, but hopeful. "So, how was work today?" Martha asked, her voice light, as she passed the vegetables to Richard. Rachel shrugged but smiled slightly. "It was okay, nothing exciting, but, better than last week." Martha glanced at Richard, who had his head down, focused on his plate. She smiled to herself, knowing that despite everything, things were getting better. They were starting to see each other, to be there for each other in a way they hadn't before. "Richard," said Martha suddenly, looking up at her, "I know I haven't always been the easiest to deal with, but I'm glad you've stuck with me, and I hope we can keep this going, keep us going." Martha looked at him, her eyes soft. "I'm here," she said simply, a smile tugging at her lips. "I'm here, Richard, and I always will be." For the first time in years, Martha felt like she could breathe. There were still challenges ahead, still scars to heal, but they were a family again. Imperfect, yes, but real. They were choosing to be present, choosing to face their fears, their past, and their future together, and that was enough. Have you ever experienced a moment when you thought everything was lost, but then things started to shift? How did it feel to finally see the possibility of healing? Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as can ever imagine, so do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.